The vast majority of those working in the arts say they've experienced or witnessed boycotting. This has led to increased anxiety from artists, venues, and managers over what they can and cannot do without risking their livelihoods. These are the findings of a new report by campaign group Freedom in the Arts, which has released new guidelines to help those navigating boycott pressure. To talk more about this project, I'm delighted to introduce co-director of Freedom in the Arts, Rosie Kay. Welcome, Rosie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Rosie, we've been talking a long time about how freedom in the arts is becoming increasingly stifled, increasingly difficult. But I was still really shocked to read this report and see just how chilling those testimonies of the people that you interviewed were. Could you first give an outline of exactly how bad things are in the arts at the moment and why these guidelines that you've developed are so necessary right now?
So we published our first report in May last year, and that was focused very much on kind of the issues that artists were facing. And it was sort of predominantly around the subsidized world. And that really sort of showed direct, stark increase of censorship and kind of evidence of a hostility within the atmosphere in the arts. With this report, the new Boycott Crisis, we weren't just looking at artists, we widened it out to also survey and interview people that ran venues, venue owners, arts organisation leaders. And then we also had a kind of quite unique slant of interviewing and survey results from agents, managers and promoters. And I suppose a slightly wider focus was rather than just the Arts Council funded subsidised world, we were also interested in maybe the slightly more commercial realm of the music industry, music festivals and literature festivals and publishing. So that's actually kind of where this atmosphere is now really hitting the bottom line. So we kind of took a pattern rather than it just being about individual artists suffering isolated incidents. We're starting to look at the whole sort of systems that are actually now boycott can be particularly around Israel-Palestine issues, but it can be about anything. And it's more than just individual boycotts. It's actually organizations are boycotted, venues find themselves getting boycott activists, agents feel trapped in between. So we're starting to paint a much bigger picture of how this is shifting how everybody works in the industries.
And it is really interesting because, as you mentioned, when we think of boycotting in the arts, we think of individuals, we think of artists, singers, writers being boycotted. But you actually spoke to venue managers as well, who are increasingly under pressure. What kind of fears were they articulating? What were their experiences?
It tends to come from two places. One is activists. So if you have, now these might be sort of small numbers, but they are very well organized and they can be very persistent and I think possibly quite terrifying. But also venues might say have signed on to certain things like the apartheid free zone in Bristol, for example, or other sort of activities like that sort of allow themselves to be pressurized by activists. But then the other factor we're seeing is from staff within venues, even when they're told they don't have to be at a show, they don't have to work, or if they do work, they don't have to be in the auditorium. Even then, sometimes staff will complain, multiple complaints, and that can kind of really terrify sort of just management staff and snarl you up on lots of HR. And then we've got artists targeting other artists. So if there's, say, an Israeli poet on a book festival lineup, other artists might boycott the whole festival and withdraw their services, and then they might target other artists, trying to get them to withdraw. We've seen that in music festivals as well. So there's a kind of whole system. I mean, I think it really is important to say it doesn't seem to be coming from the audiences themselves. So actually this is a deprivation. The audience is getting deprived of some of these artists, their work, and maybe some of the audience doesn't care as much as the activists and the other artists do.
I wanted to ask you specifically about what the boycotting actually looks like, because the report makes the point that this isn't just traditional boycotting. It uses phrases like anticipatory cancellation, institutional anxiety, silent boycotts. What do these things look like in practice?
So quite a lot of things happen behind the scenes silently. There'll be sort of like phone calls to venues and promoters. Now, I suppose to put that in context, like a lot of work in the arts kind of goes along behind the scenes and isn't necessarily all played out in public. And it's always sort of relied a little bit on personal relationships, trust, whether an artist is really in or whether somebody feels like, well, actually, we've programmed them for 4 years. We don't really want to invite them back again, and they're perfectly entitled to do that. So there's always been a little bit of kind of give and take. But this is different. Now, sort of people are sitting down and almost like doing a preemptive risk assessment. And if there's anything that might cause a problem, then it's just best to kind of avoid, steer away from, don't book, don't put anything into writing. It might be phone calls, but it might just be complete ghosting. So that's kind of how that's looking. I think when you've got like when festivals are boycotted, often it's around the funding and the sponsors, or even sometimes the sort of very senior management in the music industry. And any link, however tenuous, to certain things that are being boycotted could lead to your entire festival getting boycotted. And artists used to kind of like spread that word publicly as well, putting the whole festivals at risk. I mean, in the arts, we are talking even like big festivals and commercial arts, we're talking margins that can be kind of whipped away quite quickly. So there's a financial insecurity going on as well. So it's almost best to play safe. So again, that creates a real narrowing in the arts. If we're just all playing safe, all terrified, and kind of waiting for the next crisis. So I suppose we're trying to say it's not really if it's going to happen, it's when. So what you need to do is become a lot more robust. You need to have some really strong policies in place that protect freedom of expression. And you need to be ready to crisis management and kind of just be able to say, calm down, everybody, de-escalate. Here's a holding statement. Let's look at our policies. No, we feel like the emphasis should be more on protecting artists and protecting freedom of speech and freedom of expression rather than shutting down all the time.
And the report also says that the upshot of all this is a lot of good art just doesn't ever get made. It doesn't get put in front of audiences. Is that due to self-censorship, self-cancellation, people playing it safe? Or is it more to do with the amount of hoops that an artist has to jump through to get their product put in front of people?
Yeah, so there's sort of multiple levels to this, and that's actually forming another big piece of research that we're hoping to launch in the autumn that we're calling the unseen. So I think that started out with the idea that it's all the work that sort of got cancelled or kind of got preemptively cancelled. When it got to the studio, somebody had a hypothetical complaint or anxiety. But actually we're seeing that it's much bigger and more systemic than that. This is kind of like gatekeeping at all levels of the arts. It's also like what's fashionable and unfashionable, even in the training establishments, like what's kind of been whittled out of arts training, where we've got to a point where so many artists are just activists first and artists second. And so I think we're seeing a dwindling of standards there, because also arts criticism is now about the sort of what the artist's beliefs are or their identity rather than the actual art itself. So I'm pretty worried that this is going to have like a long-term effect. We're going to sort of see it going through the system for several years to come.
And a point that's made in the toolkit is that actually capitulating to the demands of boycotters often makes things way worse for the artist or the venue or producer or whoever. Why is that the case?
I'd say that's the case because there doesn't seem to be an end to the demands. There's not a clear target. There's not a kind of like, I think people try to compare it to, say, the boycott of South Africa. There's a very sort of clear demand there, and there was a very clear endpoint and result. This is much more nebulous than that, and it kind of like floats around. And it seems like once you give into one thing, there'll be another demand and another demand and another demand. And it's almost as if the activism is about the destruction of whatever it is, the entity, the organization, the festival, or as we've also seen, the individual artist, their career, their livelihood. There's a sense, there's a far more nihilistic aim to this than just a political aim. So it does seem, and we've got the evidence to suggest that the more you sort of put out apologies or capitulate, the sort of worse it does get. And we've also got some really hopeful case studies in the report that sort of shows that if you just say no, not doing it, and here's why, and also appeal to your public, often the activists, and I'd say they're quite bullying, will back down and leave you alone, go away.
And the report has a strong focus on anti-Semitism. It seems that Israel and Jewishness, actually, in general, seems to be a big motivator for boycotts in the arts these days. Were there any examples of that particularly struck you?
So rather than like having a kind of separate sort of section for anti-Semitism, what we've tried to do is draw anti-Semitism through the entire report. We want to show how it's really affecting artists' life, often just for being Jewish. No links with Israel, not sort of public links or anything, just simply for being Jewish, having Jewish heritage, having slightly Jewish content in their work. That will get them cancelled. Then we're seeing it in the venues. Any artist, again, it might be Jewish or links with Israel, will get the venue boycotted. And then with agents, we're finding they're really sort of stuck between sometimes asking their artists to be quiet or protecting their artists and hanging on to those business relationships. So it goes right the way through the whole sector. I think the worst case was Josh Breslau from the band Ovavoy, where their band was cancelled both from Bristol and Brighton, the city where he lives, simply for being Jewish. And of course, once this was pointed out to them as being like entirely discriminatory, the venue in Bristol did back down and apologise. And I think it's getting anti-Semitism training. But I mean, as he says, it is just anti-Jewish racism. That's what it is. Also, I had a amazing artist that her work is based on a completely separate Middle Eastern country. She's been sort of making work and touring festivals for years. And she just said this year, all her bookings just dried up. No explanation given. All she can know is that it's because some of the content of her work is about Jewish history.
Is that often the case, that the art itself can be completely non-political and it's just the person attached to it has an opinion or is from a certain background, which makes them problematic, as it were?
Yes. That is happening now more and more. And I think that's where that ties really into anti-Semitism, in that you couldn't possibly imagine that if it were Chinese or Pakistani origin artists. You can't really imagine the equivalent, and that people would get away with it. Yet we're seeing that happen with Jewish artists.
And the report also mentions, quite unsurprisingly, gender-critical people, particularly gender-critical women in the arts, who have faced cancellation for a long time now, yourself included. Thinking of Roisin Murphy, thinking of the writer John Boyne as well. Can you tell us a bit more about the situation now of being gender critical in a creative space? Has that changed, or is it still as tough as it always was?
I actually think it's slightly more brazen. It's even more upfront and discriminatory. We've just supported two poets, Polly Clark, and we're supporting Abigail Otley as well. Two poets, both women, quite sort of like clear, straightforward, totally legal opinions online or in articles, and both cancelled by publishers, specifically saying it's because of your social media views. And it's entirely discriminatory, which is really shocking to me. I mean, it is even, people say, is it getting better, Rosie? I'm like, actually, in the arts, it's getting worse. And that's why we exist as Freedom in the Arts. We've got to be able to point out and say to people, we think that you're being unlawful, and we have the Equality Act in this country, and artists should be protected. That's harder because most artists are freelancers. So we're really working out how we can sort of make sure that freedom of expression is protected at all levels and all funding. So that's something that we're really hoping that venues and arts leaders will kind of get on board with. Again, this is like why we have it. It's not just the bad news. We're trying to offer some solutions with the toolkit that will talk you through how to avoid putting yourself in situations that could end up being discriminatory. Because also, we'll be coming after you if that's what you're going to do.
I think in terms of being gender critical, the temptation is to point to the likes of J.K. Rowling and say, well, look, she's still the most successful author in the world and she's gender critical, so it can be done. But obviously, she can be gender critical because she's the most successful author in the world. Was that something that you found, that artists who were already quite well established or had been in their business longer had a bit more leeway than those just starting out?
I don't agree, actually. I think sort of targeting the scalps like mine and Roisin is part of the kind of fear strategy. So that even if you sort of as a we do think there's a level of ageism going on with this, but if you're a woman in their 50s with a very successful, hard-earned, hard-fought-for career, to topple people like us, spreads fear around or everyone else. It's a warning sign. So you can't, not nobody's going to get away with this. And I do know that this has had big personal cost to J.K. Rowling. On an emotional level and a security level. Never mind. I don't know. On a business level. It's. I think there's a misogyny, pure sexism and ageism that's going on, and it's also really useful because you kind of cut out anyone that does have the skills and integrity to be doing their jobs really well, and you smear us. It's proper mobbing and smearing. It's a psychological warfare tactic, and that in itself destroys your creativity because you second guess your next threat, you're more paranoid. So you have to really fight through this and kind of know your own worth as an artist to make sure that you carry on being an artist. And I carried on, and so is Roisin, and so is J.K. Rowling. But it's not easy. I've got to say, it's not easy.
And finally, if there are any artists or people working in the arts who are experiencing boycotting or something similar, and they access your toolkit, what kind of advice can they expect to find?
So it's 3 entirely separate modules, an enormous piece of work. It's evidence-based, so it's really based on hundreds of case studies we have, and what works and what doesn't. So you'll have decision trees, frequently asked questions, sample statements, where working out where the pressure's coming from. There'll be sort of policy statements and kind of freedom of expression, guidance around. We're just finalising all the legal aspects as well. So for an organisation, you can have a look through that. There'll be like risk assessment, risk management, and then a whole swathe of case studies that you can kind of read and think through and apply. So it's an enormous 3-part sort of journey, depending on what status you are.
Yeah. And as you say, it's a huge piece of work. It's so thorough. If you could, I know it's going to be very difficult, but if you could condense that into sort of one piece of advice or some words of encouragement that you would like people working in the arts to have, what would that be?
I think the arts have to be free from fear. And this is a tool that's going to help you slow down and think things through, so that you're not just reacting through fear, bullying, or intimidation. And it also helps you just stay on the right side of the law.
Rosie Kay, thank you very much.